Hello and welcome to this, the second stage in our quarterfinal matchups. You've already seen a couple of our quarterfinalists make it through to this stage too, and we're going to get a chance to find out whether or not they can get a little bit further. I'm Tim Willoughby, joined by R&D member Ian Duke, and we've already seen Carlos Romao win a GP last weekend on hard mode, if you will, starting with just the one bye. This time round, he's got a top 8 where if he wants to win, he's going to have to play a full 4 matches. Let's head down to the feature match area and find out how he gets on against Matt Nass. Hello and welcome to this, the second stage of the quarterfinals here at Pro Tour Kaladesh. I'm Tim Willoughby, joined by R&D member Ian Duke, and we have 2 matches on the go here, both of them big stakes. 2 of these players have already won through their stage 1 quarterfinal matches. The other 2, well, they're fresh, ready to go. We're going to be kicking things off with Matt Nass playing Aetherworks Marvel. Now, Matt actually finished with the exact same record as the players that finished having to play their quarterfinal stage 1, but from picking up his losses later in the day, manages to sneak through here. But his opponent, he's Carlos Romao. We've already seen him on camera dispatching his first round opponent, and now he needs to worry about Matt Nass. Now, Ian, let's take a look at the deck list we've got going on here. We've got Matthew Nass, he's on Temur Aetherworks. Basically, he's looking to resolve that Aetherworks Marvel. How much can Carlos Romao do to stop that plan?
So Carlos's main tools here are going to be his counterspells, classically good against combo decks, and Matt Nass's deck in game 1, sort of defenseless to protect his Aetherworks Marvel from a counterspell. So what Carlos has access to are 3 Void Shatters, 2 Summary Dismissals, and then Torrential Gearhulk sort of acts as a backup counterspell later on in the game. So Carlos does have tools to interact. He's got those 5 main deck counterspells as well as Torrential Gearhulk, but that's not a huge number of them, so he's definitely going to have to work to find them in time and make sure that he budgets them correctly. I believe we'll see him just saving his counterspells for only the Aetherworks Marvel, at least as far as the early game is concerned.
Yeah, and that Glass Boas Puzzle Knot from Matt Nass alongside Aether Hub means he is ticking up on energy, but there's not really a lot of point fighting over that energy because there's so many different ways that Nass can achieve the 6 that he's going to need in order to activate Aetherworks Marvel.
That's right, Tim, and without the Marvel, the energy isn't really doing a lot for Matt Nass, so it really is all about the card Aetherworks Marvel, at least for the time being. And we do see a copy of Summary Dismissal there in Carlos Romao's hand, so that'll be online as of turn 4. The question is, with Matt Nass on the play here, is he going to be able to actually resolve that Aetherworks Marvel on turn 4 and get in ahead of that Summary Dismissal?
Well, looking at Matt Nass's hand, it does look like, at least right this moment, he does not have Aetherworks Marvel ready to go on turn 4. Cast a Vessel of Nascency with the goal of hitting the big, powerful artifact in time, but it looks like another counterspell being picked up by Carlos Romao here, and that basically perfect for him. He's now got a Void Shatter and a Summary Dismissal, and he doesn't particularly need to worry about winning the game so much as not losing it in this early stage.
That's right. All Carlos needs to do is just continue making his land drops, holding up mana, and having access to counterspells, and that's going to put him in a really good position. And yeah, you're right, Tim. That pickup of the Void Shatter is fantastic, as well as Carlos having that 4th land in the form of an island in his hand is going to mean he'll have access to both Void Shatter and Summary Dismissal starting next turn.
So Vessel of Nascency gets cracked, and for now, Matt Nass looking at hitting land drops, doing what he can to dig a little deeper. Glint Nest Crane here coming down. That's going to let him look at the top 4 cards of his library. He's looking for an artifact. If he finds one, he can reveal it and put it in his hand. Looks like it's a swing and a miss, but actually, that's not too bad for Matt Nass. If all he cares about is getting to an Aetherworks Marvel, then he's still dug 4 cards deeper.
That's true, Tim. And, you know, as we mentioned before, in game 1, Matt Nass's deck doesn't have a lot of play in terms of being able to go back and forth and defend his Aetherworks Marvel. So, especially given that Matt doesn't know for sure that Carlos has a counterspell in his hand, I think we're just going to see Matt's sort of plan A is just racing to find Aetherworks Marvel and just casting it and hoping that Carlos wasn't able to find a counterspell in time, especially since we know that Carlos Romao mulliganed to 6 this game, making it a little bit less likely that he'll have the counterspell in time.
Now, you mentioned plan A. Is there a plan B for Matt Nass's deck? If it works out that, for whatever reason, he just cannot find or cannot resolve an Aetherworks Marvel, what can he do?
So Matt Nass's contingency plan, as it were, is to be able to cast Big Eldrazi, hard casted, as we say, from his hand without using Aetherworks Marvel. And it's more likely that he'll do that with Emrakul than with Ulamog. So you can see him kind of stocking up his graveyard there, gradually reducing the cost of Emrakul. And he does have a copy of Emrakul in his hand, as well as a couple more lands. So as we get into turns, 6, 7, 8 of this game, we might see Matt Nass maneuvering toward trying to just outright cast an Eldrazi. Now, the flip side of that is Carlos Romao actually has the card Summary Dismissal in his hand, which is capable of countering not just an Eldrazi, but also stopping its cast trigger.
Yeah, basically the perfect answer to an Eldrazi, and every turn that goes by where Carlos Romao is able to draw, play a land, keep things going, it's got to be a fairly good turn for Carlos. I mean, he knows that there's only really one thing he needs to worry about in the early game. He has an answer for that. Big smiles for the Brazilian.
Yeah, he must be feeling really good right now. His hand is just chock full of all the cards that he needs. He's got 2 copies of Void Shatter. Those are there probably to cover Aetherworks Marvel, and he's going to hold on to that Summary Dismissal for a big Eldrazi. I think all that Carlos wants to see from here on out is just to continue hitting his land drops and then maybe see a Torrential Gearhulk at some point so that he can actually get some pressure onto the board while leaving up his mana to protect himself.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, yeah, card drawing, basically anything you can play at instant speed once it's clear that there's nothing going on from Matt Nass's side of things is going to be great. But for now, Matt Nass, he activates that Puzzle Knot, gains some more energy. It seems pretty comfortable that he's going to get to 6 energy. The slightly riskier side of this equation is, will he ever be able to find and indeed resolve an Aetherworks Marvel? Because that Glint Nest Crane, it represents a very slow clock indeed.
Yeah, it's not going to get the job done just pecking away for 20 turns, I don't think. And Matt Nass probably not feeling too great at this point. Coming into the game, he would have loved to just race toward Aetherworks Marvel and just try to cast it on turn 4, get it onto the battlefield, hopefully with energy, even fine without energy, just trying to get out underneath those counterspells or get to the Marvel before Carlos can find a counterspell. That window, I think, even though Matt isn't sure that Carlos is a counterspell, he has to know it's likely that by this point in the game, so he's probably not feeling great about his position right now.
Well, the Glint Nest Crane clock just halved itself. 2 copies of that in play, and it finds a Woodweaver's Puzzle Knot. That one, in addition to giving him 3 energy, will offer Matt Nass a little bit of additional life. But the way that Carlos Romao's deck tends to actually close out games involves a whole bunch of attacks with Torrential Gearhulk. At some point, the extra life becomes relevant, but we're not really going to see that happen for quite a while here. I can't imagine that Carlos is likely to start attacking with Wandering Fumarole until he has a crazy amount of lands in play.
Yeah, he's definitely not going to tap below 3 mana for sure, and when possible, he'll even leave up double counter spells as Matt Nass gets to the point where he might be able to cast 2 Aetherworks Marvels in the same turn. Now, the other way that Carlos could put some pressure on Matt Nass is resolving a Dovin Bond. Getting a Planeswalker on board is a nice way to keep gradually getting incremental advantage, potentially working toward the ultimate, but probably not in this matchup, probably just getting value off of drawing cards. Doesn't have his Dovin Bond just yet, so I think we'll just kind of see him generally trying to leave his mana open. Radiant Flames taking out those 2 Glint Nest Cranes, and the reason he's able to do this is because, again, it still leaves him with 3 untapped mana here, representing Void Shatter.
Yeah, the Radiant Flames doesn't do a great deal in this matchup. It's never going to be able to deal with any of the Eldrazi. That basically is best case scenario, killing off those Glint Nest Cranes such that that's 1 less potential avenue to victory for Matt Nass here.
And not only is it a long shot avenue for victory for Matt Nass, but it also would threaten a Planeswalker if Carlos is able to draw into Dovin Bond by spending his mana this turn just to sweep away those Glint Nest Cranes. I mean, there's only 2 Glint Nest Cranes as far as non-Eldrazi things in Matt Nass's deck that can threaten a Planeswalker. So getting him off the board now is just an efficient use of his mana and kind of some long-term planning in case he draws into Dovin Bond.
Worth noting, of course, this is not the only match that's going on right now. We have got Pierre Darjan against Ben Hull on the other table. We'll be able to bring you updates from that one as we go through. I saw Pierre Darjan just before this round started, music on, facing the wall, shadow boxing away, building up his energy in a more sort of classic sense than the way Matt Nass is doing it, in order to just make sure that he's pumped for this, his first round here at the top 8 of Pro Tour Kaladesh.
So looking at Matt Nass's hand now, we can see he has finally picked up a copy of Aetherworks Marvel. He had it last turn, decided not to play it. So, you know, again, he's realized by this point in the game, it's tremendously likely that Carlos Romao has found a counterspell, doesn't just want to play his Aetherworks Marvel into a counterspell, you know, at a convenient time for Carlos.
Starts things off with Emrakul, the Promised End there. He already has 4 different card types in the graveyard, so able to finish off the casting of it just by tapping out.
And that has got to be a big sinking feeling there for Matt Nass. You know,
apologies, 5 types.
As we said, you know, we're past the point in the game where Aetherworks Marvel is likely to resolve, and his plan B there was to resolve a big Eldrazi. There are only 2 copies of Summary Dismissal in Carlos Romao's deck. Matt knows that, so he just went for that Emrakul and was saying, you know, it's more likely than not that you don't have a copy of Summary Dismissal in your hand. As it was, Carlos did have that, so fantastic sequence of events there for Carlos.
And Matt Nass now hellbent, goes for the Aetherworks Marvel. It gets hit with a Void Shatter, and now we see a point where, with no cards in hand, Carlos Romao might start to think it may be worth to get something going on the offensive here. As things stand, though, I guess he would still need to be tapping just enough lands that he could just die to a top deck, so I guess it does make sense to hang fire. Another Emrakul.
A fantastic top deck there for Matt Nass, but it's met with Torrential Gearhole. Carlos just has all the answers this game, and this has got to be really frustrating for Matt Nass. I mean, you know, he knew coming into this matchup that especially the pre-sideboarded games are not going to be great for him, but Carlos has just had everything he's needed at each point. You know, Matt was slow to get off the ground with his deck, and Carlos just having the perfect answers, lining up exactly against Matt Nass's threats.
So the first swing takes Matt Nass to 18. He's got those Glassblowers Puzzle Knot. That means, sorry, his Woodweaver's Puzzle Knots. Those do mean that effectively he gets an extra turn or so. There's 6 life sat on the battlefield, and he's already gained 6 simply from casting them. Just a crazy amount of energy available to Matt Nass here, but nowhere to spend it.
And Matt has to be hoping at this point that Carlos has just run out of counterspells after playing essentially 3 of his 8 counterspells. But here's a second copy of Aetherworks Marvel met with a second copy of Torrential Gearhulk. So Matt trying his best to just keep playing threat after threat, but Carlos just has counterspell after counterspell.
I love how on the Gearhulk you can see the people in the foreground for scale. This is a gigantic threat, and it's one that has just completely held off everything that Matt Nass has been trying to do in this early to mid-game. And now it's really not going to take very long for those Gearhulks to simply swing in and close things out.
And to make matters even worse for Matt Nass, Carlos Romao still has a copy of Void Shatter after all that, just in case Matt Nass is able to top deck something. So Matt's best draw here would be, I think, a 3rd copy of Emrakul, and that's one of the very few things that could get him out of this situation. He's a bit short on mana to get up to Ulamog. And I think he only has about a 1-turn window here, maybe a bit more, as you mentioned, Tim, with being able to sacrifice those Woodweaver's Puzzle Knots. But the window rapidly closing here for Matt Nass.
Carlos here checking out the cards in his hand. They're not really as important as the cards he has on the battlefield right now. I mean, worth noting, of course, that with what he has in hand, it's not as if he doesn't have some things that he can do about an Emrakul resolving anyway. Stasis Snare being cast at instant speed means that even if Matt Nass was able to take control of Carlos Romao's turn, he wouldn't have a big 13-13 to be attacked into.
That's right. And Carlos giving a bit of a think there about whether he wants to activate the Wandering Fumarole. One reason not to would be it lets him leave up both Void Shatter and Stasis Snare, which would allow him to just, you know, kind of fully deal with anything that Emrakul could throw at him.
I think that Ether Hub means that he's able to do just about that anyway. Not a deck that's focused on energy, but one that creates a little bit here and there, and Ether Hub just smoothing out the 3-color decks rather nicely. Nass lining up mana here. Going to be able to crack those puzzle knots. But that enough to take game one for Carlos Romao. Carlos Romao, he's doing good work in this top 8, and we're hearing that there's been some pretty fine work going on in our other match as well. You can see the players sat ready for their game 2 already, and we're going to get a chance to jump across to that one very, very shortly, right after these messages.
Put what you've learned from watching the Pro Tour into action next weekend at Game Day. Test your skills and your new standard deck at a store near you. Top finishers are awarded special Game Day prizes, including full art premium promo cards and a champion playmat for the winner. Kaladesh is now available on Magic Duels. Build endless deck combinations with more than 1,000 unique cards. Play through hours of story with 50 campaign missions. Play Magic Duels free today on Xbox One, Steam, iPad, and iPhone.
Hello and welcome back to the Stage 2 set of quarterfinals here at Pro Tour Kaladesh. We've already seen Carlos Romao pick up his first game back against Matt Nass. While that was going on, Ben Hull, well, it looks like these players that had the warm-up of quarterfinal Stage 1 doing good work, because he took game 1 against the Frenchman Pierre, who is on blue-red spells. Now, we've seen a little bit of the red-white vehicles deck from Ben Hull already. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in game 1, or indeed, I guess, game 2, pre-sideboard for Pierre Dajon here.
So the main way that Pierre's deck is going to interact with Ben's vehicles is through cheap removal spells. Playing the likes of cards like Galvanic Bombardment, Harness Lightning, and even Dynavolt Tower. Once it gets online, can do some serious work in taking out Ben's small creatures. So Pierre's main game plan is going to be, as with any more controlling deck, he wants to continue hitting his land drops, and he wants to play efficient removal spells and just stay ahead of the game. Once he falls behind on board against Ben, he's going to start getting run over by those big vehicles.
Well, these players kicking off their second game. The red-white deck, it can be super aggressive, and it looks like at the worst there's a Thraben Inspector for Ben Hull on this first turn. Looks like he's just considering his plays, because there is also a Toolcraft Exemplar available, and Exemplar into Thraben Inspector, a very powerful start. There, held off by a Galvanic Bombardment from Pierre Dajon. He does not want to be behind too early here. Needs to take a bit of time to get things going.
Yeah, but Pierre's hand looking fairly well suited to to withstand the early game, I should say. Here he has a copy of Harness Lightning as well. Into potentially next turn, Dynavolt Tower. He's got some card draw spells as well. Goes for an Anticipate after Ben Hull adds Smuggler's Copter to the battlefield.
Dynavolt Tower, given sufficient time, a very, very big incentive to play this blue-red spells deck. Just supercharges every single spell that you cast, means that it represents some proportion of a lightning bolt. And Pierre Dajon pretty happy to get it in play good and early, because now every single thing he does for each successive turn of the game will be that much more powerful. So Depala crews up the Smuggler's Copter. It's got +1/+1 now, and in future turns, Ben Hull may choose to tap a little bit of mana in order to look at the top cards of his deck, try and find more vehicles or indeed more dwarves. In the meantime, he gets to swing in for 4 here while looting with that Smuggler's Copter.
So there was an interesting decision point for Pierre last turn. He could have, instead of playing the Dynavolt Tower, left up mana for Harnessed Lightning, preparing to answer that Smuggler's Copter when it got activated. The trouble with that line is that if Ben Hull were to play a Veteran Motorist or Depala, then the Smuggler's Copter would actually be a 4/4 by the time it was crewed, and that would leave Harnessed Lightning unable to hit it. And if Pierre went for that line of play and wasn't able to kill the Smuggler's Copter for whatever reason, that would set him really far behind on board. So worked out really well for him that he went for the Dynavolt Tower. Even though he got hit for 4, now he's just got kind of his foundation underneath him here, and that's going to really give him some benefit as the game goes long.
Yeah, Harness Lightning instead taking out Depala, and it's a bit of a nuanced interaction, the rules interaction for crewing a vehicle with something that also pumps said vehicle. There's never a window where you're going to be able to have that pump kind of on the stack to kill off the creature. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely true, Tim. So it's relatively straightforward for Depala because her ability is just a static ability that always applies to your vehicles. But in the case of Veteran Motorist, when you activate a Veteran Motorist to crew a vehicle, the Veteran Motorist trigger actually goes on top of the vehicle trigger, and so it resolves first. So by the time the vehicle actually becomes a creature, it will get the +1/+1 as well, even from a Veteran Motorist.
The Raven Inspector, though, the play here, jumping in a copter, immediately comes down, and the looting ability, so drawing and discarding, also pretty important for Ben Hull's deck. These red-white decks, they have a lot of ways of getting card selection and additional card drawing, and it looks like between the Thraben Inspector generating a clue and a second copy of Thraben Inspector and Depala, he could very easily find himself ahead on cards against an honest-to-goodness red-blue control deck.
Yeah, the red-white vehicle definitely has some ways to keep the card flow going, but I really like Pierre's position here with that Dynavolt Tower on the battlefield. You know, he's getting a fresh untap here. It's very likely he'll be able to get up to 6 energy this turn, this turn cycle, I should say, by casting 2 instants or sorceries. And then once he's done that, now he's threatening the Smuggler's Copter, representing 3 damage with the Dynavolt Tower.
So Tormenting Voice there, discarding Take Inventory. If you're looking for a spell to discard rather than a land, Take Inventory, kind of a nice one, because in the graveyard it does get counted by this, the second Take Inventory. So that's a 2-mana divination, effectively, for Pierre Dagen as he casts Take Inventory after Tormenting Voice. Everything I said about being able to keep up with cards in hand against Pierre Dagen, ignore it. Pierre is just a master at drawing cards with his deck.
Yeah, and in a way, Dynavolt Tower is also a card, not a card draw engine, but a card advantage engine, as we call it, and that every single time Pierre casts an instant or sorcery, he's getting more energy. Dynavolt Tower converts that energy into 3 damage, a lightning bolt effect, if you will, and that effect is worth approximately a card, or maybe even a little bit more.
So here comes Veteran Motorist. And Veteran Motorist, one of the better creatures to crew that Smuggler's Copter for reasons that we just discussed. Easy for Pierre Dagen to deal 3 points of damage. Much, much harder for him to deal 4, at least with the board the way that it stands.
Yeah, that's actually a huge, huge pickup there for Ben Hull because, yeah, as we were talking about before, the interaction there is now that Veteran Motorist can crew the Smuggler's Copter, and there's never a window where the Smuggler's Copter is a 3/3. By the time it's a creature, it is a 4/4, and that means that Pierre Dagen's Dynavolt Tower cannot take out that Smuggler's Copter. That's going to give Ben an extra loot, help him with his card selection. It's going to hit Pierre for an extra 4 damage. Pierre taking 6 this turn goes down to 7, and now is under a lot of pressure. Selfless Spirit added to the board. That's basically a magnet, a lightning rod, if you will, for the Dynavolt Tower, essentially forcing Pierre to use the Dynavolt Tower on that before getting to any of Ben Hull's higher priority creatures. So now quite a tough situation here for Pierre Dagen.
Yeah, this already we've seen that Hull has picked up the first game, and I can't help but wonder whether or not it was a similar sort of story to what we're seeing here. That not only is there relentless aggression from the red-white vehicles deck, but it has a number of areas where it can kind of usefully interact with what Pierre's got going on. And one player who's going to be very seriously watching this match and rooting for Ben Hull is Shota Yasuoka. Talking to Shota about the various matchups that he could face, he was saying, if I have to play against Dynavolt Tower, that could be a big problem. So Pierre Dagen, he's got some options here. Wandering Fumarole in hand, but he may want to take advantage of some card drawing first to see if he can find an untapped land.
Yeah, the tricky thing for Pierre here is he's just under so much pressure from such a variety of threats. He would really love to have a sweeper type effect, although I'm not sure he actually has many or any in his main deck here, taking a look. I don't believe he has great ways to deal with multiple creatures at once. He's mostly playing a 1-for-1 removal game. And, while things are looking scary here for Pierre, it was really that last turn for Ben that cemented Ben's lead in this game, and specifically that Veteran Motorist. If it weren't exactly for that card and Pierre was able to take out the Smuggler's Copter, he'd be looking at a lot more stable board right now, and he'd also have a much higher life total. So it's really just in this last turn cycle that things have kind of taken a turn for the worse for Pierre Dagen.
Take Inventory, allowing Pierre Dagen to draw 3 cards there, gaining some energy along the way. But even with a huge grip of cards, he may find it that he's not able to get everything he needs going. I believe that was end of turn, discard Fiery Temper to hand size and trigger Madness.
Neat little trick there.
Still the 1 mana up, and of course the Dynavolt Tower now at 5 energy, that kind of the magic number here. Depala Pilot Exemplar is not going to be the friend of Pierre Dajon here, effectively facing a very similar set of circumstances to what we saw just a couple of turns ago.
So Ben with a couple decisions here. You know, he's choosing between playing the Depala or playing the Gideon. Both are pretty good options here. If he plays the Depala and uses it to crew the Smuggler's Copter, he has a 4/4 Smuggler's Copter and a pair of 1/2 Thraben Inspectors. That puts Pierre in a position where he probably has to use his Dynavolt Tower on the Depala. Now, what Ben's thinking about is what if Pierre has a 1-mana removal spell, like a Galvanic Bombardment, for example? You know, how can he pair that together with a Dynavolt Tower activation? Ben's other option is to play Gideon, and once he has the Gideon on the board, he may decide to make an emblem before activating the Smuggler's Copter. And again, that'll make the Smuggler's Copter a 4/4 with no window where it's a 3/3, and make it extremely likely that the Smuggler's Copter will get through. But again, thinking about, well, maybe there's a Galvanic Bombardment paired with a Dynavolt Tower activation. That makes going all in on the Gideon emblem a little bit less appealing. So quite a few different decisions here, and the right one really depends on what Ben thinks Pierre has in hand.
Well, he's gone with the Knight Ally, that meaning that the Smuggler's Copter is going to get crewed as a 3/3.
You don't have an emblem, right, in this game? I do not. At this time, sure.
And I like this play. It's a little bit of a hedge, and that means Ben's not going for the kill this turn, but he is getting the Gideon on the board, which is, you know, a tough threat for Pierre to deal with. That does allow Pierre's Dynavolt Tower to take out the Smuggler's Copter, which is good for, you know, from Pierre's perspective, but now he also has to deal with the Gideon as well.
Yeah, 5 life to work with, not a whole lot against these red-white decks. Not so many honest-to-goodness burn spells that go to the dome in red-white vehicles as in some of the other variations on red-white. We don't necessarily see Incendiary Flow, perhaps, in this particular list where we might do elsewhere. But nonetheless, a huge amount of damage threatened by just about everything that's in the red-white vehicles deck, even if it is more creature-centric.
Pierre's hand looking tough here. Now, it was really, we saw the Fiery Temper discarded a hand size last turn. In order to do that, Pierre had to actually skip a land drop. So you can see now, with 3 lands in his hand and only 4 on the battlefield, he really wished he had more mana to work with this turn. But he needed to do what he needed to do, and you know, if he had a 5th land starting this turn and was able to play a 6th turn, we might see him go for a Glimmer of Genius, netting 4 energy off of that, leaving himself with 2 mana. 2 mana being the magic number where he could draw into something like a Harnessed Lightning. But being constrained on mana, has to go for the Anticipate instead. I think he's hoping to find Harnessed Lightning or Galvanic Bombardment this turn would probably be the best cards he can see.
Yeah, Pierre Dajon here, a long way off being able to start even thinking about Ben Hull's life total. When the blue-red spells deck does start dealing damage, it can deal quite a bit in a very tenacious manner. Those Dynavolt Towers, they do stack up real nice. If you end up with more than one of them in play, well, it gets messy real fast.
So it looks like Pierre did pick up a Harnessed Lightning off of that Anticipate. It's, you know, one of the better draws he could have gotten off of that. Unclear whether it's going to be enough to pull him out of this situation. He is staring down that Gideon. From Pierre's standpoint, you know, it looks like he may be able to live through the next turn. Well, perhaps not. I mean, Gideon threatens to activate and just get in for 5. You know, we've seen Ben be cautious in the past. There's a chance that he might think about combinations of spells that could help Pierre here, but with the players knowing each other's deck lists, and I'm looking through here, there's not a ton that I'm seeing that Pierre can really do about Gideon just activating into a creature and attacking. You can see Pierre fiddling with his mana a little bit on his own turn, thinking about what he can do. But again, if he taps out, then it just becomes super obvious for Ben to just activate Gideon and attack for 5.
Wandering Fumarole coming down, and Pierre Dajon choosing to at least maintain an air of mystery in terms of what he has going on. But as soon as the attacks come from Ben Hull, that enough for Dajon to scoop up his cards. Hull leading 2-0 as the players move to their sideboards before their game 3.
And if I play them, I lose because I'm going to discard by Fiery Temper.
Dajon there just explaining the situation with having to skip a land drop to discard Fiery Temper, as you had outlined, Ian. But we're going to be jumping back across to Matt Nass and Carlos Romao, just catching things up, moving our cameras along here. And Matt Nass, he'll have had a bit of time to think about what he hopes to happen in game 2, and it's kind of exactly the same story that we saw in Game 1 in many respects. Again, on the play, having lost that game. So again, he's desperately hoping to be able to land Aetherworks Marvel in that window before Carlos Romao perhaps has the counter magic that he needs in order to stop the big threats.
That's right. And remember, again, since we are playing best out of 5, the first 2 games are both pre-sideboard, so the players will be playing with the same configuration of their decks as they played with last game. So all of those same things still stand. Carlos Romao with effectively 8 counter spells to work with in his deck, if you include the Torrential Gearhulks. And, Matt Nass on the play here, probably, again, trying to play a race-type game where he's just going as quickly as possible to resolving Aetherworks Marvel.
Well, once again, Romao with the summary dismissal in hand. Again, there is this potential that might be a turn too slow. We will see whether or not that ends up playing out. Romao with a bit of experience when it comes to playing control decks in high stakes. When he won the World Championship in 2002, he was playing Psychotog, and at the time he was playing with the strategy of, I don't care about your card drawing, I don't care about the removal spells you're casting, all I care about is you resolving your big threat or me resolving mine. And kind of a similar sort of story going on here. All he needs to do is stop that Aetherworks Marvel. Matt Nass carefully considering his options here as he goes for a contingency plan. Nass, this is exactly the kind of deck that he's most comfortable with. It's a combo deck. It involves a bit of long-term planning in terms of what's happening from turn to turn. We can see Emrakul the Promised End in hand along with a couple of puzzle knots. So right now we're in the stage where it's dig, dig, dig. Let's try and find that Aetherworks Marvel.
What's interesting about playing contingency plan there, for Matt, is that he kind of needs to make the decision right away if he's going to go all in on just jamming Aetherworks Marvel on turn 4. Only seeing Carlos Romao's first land drop. He doesn't know anything about, will Carlos, miss a land drop? Will he have the right colors? What else is going on with Carlos's draw? And so I think that really requires Matt having a clear picture of how he wants to play this matchup, coming right in off of the first couple turns.
Now, these copies of Anticipate, just great for Carlos Romao in these pre-sideboarded games because they mean that he can find the important cards in the matchup, but also he can choose to not draw some of the cards that are weaker for him in the matchup. We saw he got a look at more copies of Radiant Flames. That's not really what he's looking to do here, and able to just push that to the bottom.
Yeah, it's very true, Tim. Although Carlos's deck does have some potent tools against Matt Nass's combo deck in these pre-sideboard games, Carlos also has a tremendous number of dead cards. All these copies of, Harnessed Lightning and Radiant Flames, Fumigate, they're not really useful at all against what Matt is doing. And that's a really good point, that the card selection of something like Anticipate is really, really important.
Well, Carlos Romao has successfully navigated his way to turn 4 without already falling to a big Eldrazi. He has summary dismissal in hand. Now we find ourselves in the mid stages of the game where each turn, Matt Nass is trying to push toward being able to get something going, but he's going to have to fight through real counter magic.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate for Matt that he didn't have the Marvel on turn 4 in either of these games. Being on the play in both of them would be a great opportunity to get out ahead of summary dismissal, as we've said a number of times. But despite digging a lot, he hasn't been able to find it on time just yet. And that's one of the weaknesses of a combo deck like this, especially one that revolves around one particular card that you can only play 4 copies of in your deck. Despite all this, search and card draw and card selection, there are just games where you don't find it on time or don't find it at all. And, in that sense, we sometimes say combo decks often lose to themselves some percentage of the time.
Now, Matt Nass, when we say that he's a combo player, part of that means is that he's a player with the temperament that can handle those swings. It's not the kind of deck that necessarily everyone's going to feel comfortable with until they've really internalized how frequently it is possible to get to the right answer, and indeed practiced enough that they're able to do so in a crisp and clean manner.
That's right. When you sign up to play a deck like this, you do have to realize and accept that there is variance and that you're making your plays based on, calculated and weighted odds, and sometimes they don't work out in your favor. And sometimes they do, but it's still about making the right play, not about the result necessarily that happened.
Oh yeah. Keep forgetting.
Yeah, Matt Nass, one of a number of players actually that have found themselves in the feature match area trying to find a number higher than 12 on a 12-sided die. Typically 12 energy, kind of high watermark, but these Aetherworks Marvel decks, they can go big.
So we're getting up to the point where Matt Nass is close to playing Emrakul. I do believe there are 5 card types in his graveyard: artifact, creature, instant, land, and sorcery. And he's just played his 7th land tapped. So if he has an untapped land for next turn, we could see him attempt Emrakul. Of course, we know that Carlos Romao is sitting on a copy of Summary Dismissal. Matt does not know that. Matt knows that Carlos Romao only has 2 copies of Summary Dismissal in his entire deck. And, you know, again, the chances are fairly good that Carlos has not seen that card yet. So I imagine we will see Matt Nass just go for Emrakul as soon as he is able to.
Well, one of the cards that doesn't do too much in the main deck for Matt Nass, able to get an outing here. Ether Meltdown being played on Torrential Gearhulk. Kind of an aggressive Gearhulk from Carlos Romao, flashing back a copy of Anticipate. But this is another way that he can make sure that Matt Nass is not able to get the full amount of pressure going on, is by simply saying, I'm going to attack your life total.
Matt Nass picking up only a Woodweaver's Puzzle Knot, really one of the least helpful cards you could have seen that turn. Puts him up to 19 energy and 28 life, but neither of those are resources that really matter too much to Matt Nass right now.
Yeah, one of the challenges, I think, for anyone watching a game of Magic, especially if you're kind of newer to it, is how do you figure out who's winning? Typically, you can look at life totals, you can look at amount that's on the board. In this instance, neither of those numbers necessarily telling the full story. Carlos Romao, the most important thing that's going on is what we have access to here, which is that we can see that in his hand, well, there's all sorts going on. Most importantly, Void Shatter and Summary Dismissal.
Yeah, as for the question of who's winning, the simple answer to that right now is absolutely Carlos Romao, given that we know what is in his hand right now. He's also adding some pressure to the battlefield here with Archangel Avacyn. And again, as you mentioned, Tim, you know, life total is not really super relevant in this matchup, at least from Matt Nass's point of view. What really matters here is that as long as Carlos can keep counterspells in hand and keep Eldrazi and Aetherworks Marvel off the battlefield, he is going to be in a good spot.
Yeah, interestingly, even permanence in play against Aetherworks Marvel doesn't necessarily tell the whole story. If Carlos Romao was simply playing a blue-white beatdown deck here that had no counter magic available to it whatsoever, then Matt Nass might actually feel kind of fine about this situation. He knows that if he can get an Eldrazi into play, it ought to be good enough. As things stand, life a lot trickier for Matt Nass, as by the looks of things right now, his hand is all about those Eldrazi, and while he is hitting the point where he may be able to cast one of them, we know that that might just not be good enough.
Yeah, and again, this must be a frustrating situation from Matt's point of view because he's been stuck with just one fewer land than he needs to cast Emrakul for quite several turns here. And Matt knows that the more time that passes by, not only is Carlos putting pressure on Matt's life total, but Carlos is actually having more chances to draw into Summary Dismissal. And from Matt's point of view, he must be thinking like, you know, Carlos may not have had the Summary Dismissal 3 turns ago when I was ready to play this Emrakul, but I just haven't been able to get a chance to play Emrakul yet. And you know, by the time I play it, Carlos might have found that Summary Dismissal. He just doesn't know. But he must be getting, you know, more and more nervous about that as time is going on.
Yeah, I can't help but wonder if, as and when Matt Nass decides to watch back on the replays, he will almost be satisfied to learn that Summary Dismissal was there from the beginning and that it's not as if all of this extra time that Carlos Romao had changed the outcome of the game.
Yeah, and I mean, as in terms of the way Matt has been playing this matchup, he hasn't had a tremendous number of choices. He's been making the right ones just in terms of, you know, I think he knows what his game plan is. He's been trying to go for the Marvel as quickly as possible, just hasn't been able to find it. He's been cycling through his deck. He's been playing Glint Nest Cranes and Puzzle Knots, searching it as quickly as he can to play his threats, and it just his draws haven't worked out for him, and Carlos's have been fantastic.
Now, Dovin Ban here for Carlos Romao. Do not worry too much about the emblem there. Basically, I think that the way we're going to see it get played out here is that Romao has now an additional way of gaining life and drawing cards. As we said previously, life not too big a deal in this matchup, but cards very important indeed. And that enough to mean that Matt Nass has even more to worry about.
Carlos picking up, I think, a second copy of Void Shatter there. And again, just well stocked with counter magic, way out in front of Matt in terms of threats versus answers. You know, one way you can think of these matchups is for every big threat that Matt draws, whether it's an Eldrazi or an Aetherworks Marvel, Carlos needs to have drawn a counter spell by the time that happens. So if you're kind of just counting like pluses and minuses on each side, Carlos is in some ways, +3 against Matt Nass's threats. Matt having, I believe, 2 Emrakuls in his hand. So if he has time, he'd love to find, I think, an 8th land that he needs there and just play an Emrakul one turn, have it get summary dismissal, try for an Emrakul the next turn. So Matt's not out of the game yet. Misses again on a land, finds a Glint Nest Crane. Would love to find an Aetherworks Marvel and just go for that, try to drain Carlos's counter magic a little bit. But I think Matt's best path to actually winning this game is he needs an untapped land next turn, so this Aetherworks Marvel is going to get Void Shattered, we can assume. But what Matt's going to need to happen is to draw an untapped land next turn and try for Emrakul number 1. That will get summary dismissaled, and then the following turn try for Emrakul number 2. And Carlos will be able to Void Shatter that, but then at least Matt will gain control of Carlos's turn, maybe be able to do something in terms of using Carlos's resources against him. But with that Dovin Bond ticking away and drawing cards, and Torrential Gearhulk chipping in for a bit of damage,
it definitely makes life a lot harder. I mean, the 2 copies of Aether Meltdown, that is both copies in the main deck for Matt Nass. Doing good work of keeping him in this game for quite a bit longer. No really particularly impressive attacks available to Carlos Romao here, which means Matt Nass's life total, in spite of all of these turns that passed, still on a full 20. I believe that at this point, Matt Nass on 30 energy is at the high point for the amount of energy that anyone has had in play at any point during this tournament. I'm guessing it was a conscious choice by R&D to make sure that there weren't easy ways of just burning through loads of energy in one go.
Yeah, that's a great point. One of our fundamental rules about energy is we didn't want there to be a very easy way to convert energy into life total, because what that makes you do is now anytime you're checking your life against what your opponent's capable of doing, you need to add together your energy and your life total. Also, there are just situations where, a deck can race to build up a ton of energy and then just, would be able to kill their opponent in one turn all of a sudden just by dumping all of their energy, and that's not particularly fun gameplay. So as we were toying around with different energy designs, those were things that we tried to avoid as much as possible. It also made it so there weren't really particularly interesting decisions about how to spend your energy over time.
Yeah, if there's one big payoff, then it makes sense for everyone to be saving up. This way around, there's lots of small payoffs, and it makes for much more gameplay.
Yep, we were really going for the dynamic gameplay with energy as much as possible.
So it looks like Romao here, his cup runneth over when it comes to land.
Cast this on my hook. Okay.
Honest Lightning on the Gearhulk.
Go up to 12, so and down to 7. 6. There's 6. Triggers. Okay.
Interesting. So Carlos Romao here killing off his own Gearhulk because that triggers Archangel Avacyn, and when Archangel Avacyn transforms, well, now we have a potent threat on the board that is actually able to do something relevant in spite of the copy of Aether Meltdown that's hanging out there.
That's right. Remember, Aether Meltdown only giving a creature -4/-0, so now that 6/5 Avacyn will be able to attack in for 2 each turn. So it's not a ton of damage, it's not a super fast clock, but it does add up.
Yeah, but I mean, that's exactly the kind of play that sets apart Carlos Romao. I don't know that that's necessarily one everyone would spot. Here comes Emrakul, the promised end from Matthew Nass. Let's see what we have from Carlos Romao in response.
Steal your turn 1 resolves first.
Sure.
Steal your turn resolves first.
Okay.
I guess.
So,
Well, as it turns out, summary dismissal is what happens, but we know that the big Emrakul plan is not over yet. That one was the sort of hinted at end. The next one might be more of a promise. Stasis now a great pickup though there for Carlos Romao. Even if it works out that his turn gets stolen, it gives him an instant speed way of dealing with Emrakul that is not actually an instant because, of course, Emrakul laughs off any instance that one might try to use to deal with her.
And it looks like Carlos Romao has picked up a Torrential Gearhulk either this turn or recently. And, as we were outlining Matt Nass's multi-turn sequence of trying to, get through that Emrakul, first with an Aetherworks Marvel, then the first Emrakul, then a second Emrakul, now the presence of Torrential Gearhulk effectively means a second copy of Summary Dismissal is within access for Carlos Romao. So if Matt goes for a second copy of Emrakul next turn, now he'll be facing down a Gear Hulk into Summary Dismissal, and that's just a ton of damage represented the next turn. It may, in fact, be lethal if Carlos has a second copy of Wandering Fumarole.
Well, that Nass has plenty of copies of Emrakul. That's the one thing that he is able to rely on. Unfortunately, he cannot rely on them resolving. Even the cast triggers being stopped by Summary Dismissal there,
And
thanks to
actually,
Torrential Gear Hulk.
it looks like I don't even think Carlos needs a second copy of Wandering Fumarole. He's got 5 from the Gear Hulk, plus 4 from the Fumarole, plus 2 more from the Avacyn. So that represents the 11 that Matt Nass has, and Matt sees it and will scoop them up.
Well, it looks like the players that made it through quarterfinal 1 just rocking and rolling here in quarterfinal stage 2. Already, each of them 2 games up, and now we move to sideboarding, Ian. Now, in each of these matchups, we're going to see some relatively substantial changes available to these decks in order to perhaps make these matchups feel a little bit fairer. We're going to be kicking things off with Pierre Dajon's post-sideboarded first game against his opponent there, Ben Hull. Now, Ben Hull, he gets access to a little bit of artifact removal, which is potentially going to be relevant against Dynavolt Tower. But I really want to talk about Pierre Dajon because he has access to a creature plan out of the sideboard, which is one that we've seen all tournament long be fairly potent.
Yeah, I can't say for sure exactly how Pierre is going to sideboard here, but he does have some nice options. Thing in the Ice is the one that stands out the most to me. It's just a fantastic early blocker, and it allows him to threaten at instant speed to transform the Thing in the Ice into Awoken Horror and just bounce all creatures back to their owner's hand. So he can do that, for example, in the middle of Ben's attack after vehicles have been crewed and so on and so forth. Niblis of Frost is a card that Pierre may or may not bring in. It's very effective at locking down creatures. There's a chance that he feels it's too slow. He might only want to bring in a small number of copies here since Ben's deck is quite fast. Certainly Galvanic Bombardment is going to be coming in here, just very effective at removing earlier creatures. And, depending again on where Pierre wants to take his deck in the post-sideboard matchup, Torrential Gear Hulk might come in also just as a little bit of extra value and a way to end the game fairly quickly. But my bet is for sure Thing in the Ice and Galvanic Bombardment are coming in. Maybe some copies of Niblis of Frost and maybe the Torrential Gear Hulk. Less clear on those.
I mean, I guess that one of the challenges for Ben Hull is, he's been sideboarding with access to what is going on for Pierre Dajon. So he needs to think about exactly which direction Dajon's going. We can see that he's got the likes of Chandra, great against control, Gideon, great against control. But it'll be interesting to see exactly which way he goes with this because you don't want to change things up too much if you've got a winning plan.
Yeah, my bet here for Ben's sideboarding plan would be to bring in the 3 Planeswalkers. As you mentioned, they're great against control in general, and they're specifically good against a blue-red base control deck because Red's way of dealing with Planeswalkers is dealing damage, and these are fairly high-loyalty Planeswalkers that might take, for example, 2 activations of Dynavolt Tower or an activation plus another burn spell to take out. Beyond the Planeswalkers, Fragmentize looks like it probably should come in here, Dynavolt Tower being such an important card for Pierre's deck that I think Ben is willing to slow down the speed of his deck a little bit in order to have a nice, efficient answer to Dynavolt Tower.
Lovely stuff. Well, the players are ready to go, so let's head down to our feature match area again to see this first sideboarded game between Pierre Dajon and Ben Hull. Players, they've had a little bit of time to think about this, and it looks like Dajon kicking things off on a 6-card hand. Not ideal, but he will be on the play here because he did lose the first couple of games and had that prerogative. There we can see Ben Hull's stats. The 33-year-old still just working on the beginnings of his Pro Tour career. Played 1 Pro Tour, top 8'd 1 Pro Tour. That's the way to do it. Toolcraft example of the early play from Ben Hull. And that one threatens a lot of damage here. Pierre Dajon, we're not quite sure what he's got going on just yet, but he would, if he could, want to be able to deal with that threat earlier on. And Harness Lightning will do it, even leaving behind a couple of energy, which may prove pretty relevant later on in the game. Well, looking at Hull's hand, there's a lot of lands in there, so he's not going to be sad at all to see that Veteran Motorist potentially letting him push further lands to the bottom and make sure that his next couple of draws are strong ones. Declaration in Stone in Hull's hand. That's showing some respect for creatures that he did not see in Game 1. And this, I guess, is one of the differences between a top 8 match and what you may have seen in the Swiss rounds of this tournament. there would be every reason to think after game one, this is a creatureless deck. I don't want Declaration in Stone. I want to just continue piling on the pressure and hoping that it works out a little better this time. Here in this top 8, these players, they've got access to the full deck list and sideboard of their opponents, at which point Declaration in Stone looks like a pretty good answer to an otherwise problematic Thing in the Ice.
That's right. I'm for sure the Declaration in Stone is there primarily to answer a Thing in the Ice. You know, it also maybe could take out a random Torrential Gearhulk that's blocking the way, or if Pierre brings in, you know, some number of Nibluses of Frost, which I think he probably won't, but he might bring in 1 or 2. We will end up seeing, you know, having some access to creature removal is going to be really important for Ben Hull against those powerful utility creatures.
So Dynavolt Tower down. It didn't initially have enough energy to do too much, but it's not going to take many spells to change that. Pierre Nala joining the force for Ben Hull, and of course bringing a Thopter with her. So he's done a good job of widening out his board, and Pierre, kind of a nice threat when your opponent is playing 1-for-1 removal spells.
Yeah, fantastic card we've seen all throughout the tournament, all this weekend. Just, you know, great value, has good synergy with artifacts, vehicles, all sorts of things. And here comes that Declaration in Stone on the Thing in the Ice. That's the job it was meant to do. Does it effectively.
And that clears a path for big attacks here from Ben Hull. Uses his additional mana just to pump up his Thopter token. Pierre Nala doing a bit of extra duty there to make sure that even though Ben Hull has drawn quite a few lands here, he's still got relevant things to do with his mana each and every turn.
And losing that Thing in the Ice was a big, big deal for Pierre. I think that was sort of what he was counting on to catch up on board a little bit. Without that there, his hand is looking a little bit clunky to me.
I mean, he has drawn a second copy of Thing in the Ice, which is nice. But I guess the tricky thing is that he needs to actually get to play enough spells in time for it to transform.
Exactly, and the part of his hand that's looking clunky is that it doesn't look like he can actually cast 2 spells this turn, because I don't see access to a 4th land for Pierre here, which means he needs to decide between casting a removal spell like Harness Lightning or Fiery Temper, or just casting the Thing in the Ice and hoping it sticks. But either way, he stands to take a bunch more damage, and then presumably Ben Hull will add even more to his board the following turn. Now, what's also super tricky is if Pierre goes for the Thing in the Ice, the way his hand looks right now, it doesn't look like he's going to be able to transform it anytime soon. So personally, I think I like going with either a Harness Lightning or a Fiery Temper here this turn. You get a little bit more energy toward the Dynavolt Tower. You stem the bleeding a little bit in terms of protecting your life total. And, you know, if Pierre gets a little bit lucky and Ben doesn't have a lot to follow up with on the next turn, we could see him stabilize from that point.
So Pierre Dajon just checking some text on a card before he plays out his hand. There's Sky Sovereign in hand for Ben Hull, and that kind of an interesting one because this is not a matchup where it's going to shoot a whole lot down, but it still, I guess, is just a gigantic monster, which is kind of where he might want to be if he's going to be playing out creatures, playing out things that are going to be difficult to answer with just the one spell. Harness Lightning here doing great work, able to kill off Veteran Motorist while leaving behind plenty of extra energy such that Dynavolt Tower could get active too. That really blunted Ben Hull's attacks greatly. And Sky Sovereign, yes, it gets to go to the dome for 3. Sorry, it doesn't actually have any targets for the 3
Yeah,
damage.
it can only hit creature or planeswalker with its triggered ability there. So quite a nice turn for Pierre there. He kind of dodged a bullet in a way with Ben Hull only be able to add the Sky Sovereign, and Sky Sovereign not actually having any creatures that can crew it on board right now. So, you know, Pierre again will be hoping that next turn Ben can't find a creature to crew that Sky Sovereign and can get a little bit of breathing room to start getting things going. So here's Take Inventory, just cycling a little bit, maybe hoping to hit a 4th land drop, getting a little bit of energy for Dynavolt Tower.
And big draws from here on in because Ben Hull just needs to find a 3-power creature. That Thopter does not qualify, just has to swing in the air on its own. I'm sure.
So notably, no 4th land for Pierre on the previous turn there.
Fragmentize on Dynavolt Tower. Pierre sort of smiles and points at the clue, asks whether or not that's the one that they wanted to target. It's like, no, I think I'll get rid of this bomb rare.
So we're getting a bit more information about how the players have sideboarded. We did see the Fragmentize come in for Ben Hull, and we do see in Pierre's hand he actually has his 2nd copy of Torrential Gearhulk, meaning that did come in from the sideboard. Really clunky there actually for Pierre, getting, unfortunately for him, a little bit punished for having a bit extra top end in his deck there, missing land drops and getting clogged on those Gearhulks. he may not find time to play them depending on what Ben's able to follow up with.
Well, Toolcraft Exemplar, a big draw here for Ben Hull. It's not naturally a 3-power creature, but as soon as we hit the combat step, well, it's going to get +2/+1 thanks to the fact that there's artifacts in play. That making it just big enough to hop on board Sky Sovereign, and Sky Sovereign attacks for a lot of damage.
And just clarifying this interaction here for folks at home who may not have seen it, Toolcraft Exemplar gets +2/+1 at the beginning of combat if you control an artifact. So what Ben's doing is saying, we're moving to my combat step, I'm going to get this trigger for my Toolcraft Exemplar, let it resolve, then I'm going to crew my vehicle, and now my vehicle will attack. That gets in for 6 damage, +1 from the Thopter, putting Pierre Dajon down to 1 life. And now with so many threats that he needs to answer, I can't see a great way for Pierre to get out of this.
Pierre Dajon, we saw him shadowboxing, getting pumped up for this match just prior to its beginning. But unfortunately for him, it looks like the knockout punch coming from the other side of the table. Ben Hull, his life total has been untroubled this entire match as far as I can tell. And it looks like we may well be seeing him advancing to our semifinals.
So here's Tormenting Voice, discarding Fiery Temper, being cast for its madness cost. And we'll see what Pierre is able to draw into. You know, I think he's either going to need a 1-mana removal spell or land plus a 2-mana removal spell to take out that Thopter, and then also hope that Ben isn't able to find another creature to crew that Sky Sovereign.
Yeah, a lot of things need to go right here, and it looks like they have not gone right for him, but big smiles for Ben Hull. I spoke to him after his first quarterfinal match, and he sort of said, I don't know what's going on here. It's all kind of a dream. First Pro Tour, and you can see the big smile from him. He will be advancing to the semifinals. Meanwhile, we're going to get a chance to jump across and see a little bit more magic, because now we have the sideboarded games for Matt Nass versus Carlos Romao, and we're going to see a bit more interaction at this stage.
Absolutely true. So without getting into whether it favors which player it favors here, as you said, Tim, in general, the matchup is going to get a lot more interactive as both players bring in more ways to fight each other via counterspells. So this is Matt Nass's sideboard that we're taking a look at here. The major card that stands out to me is Dispel in 4 copies here. Dispel is so important for Matt's game plan. What it's going to allow him to do is wait until he has 5 mana, then cast Aetherworks Marvel, and if Carlos has a counterspell, like say a Void Shatter, Matt can respond with Dispel, countering the Void Shatter, allowing the Aetherworks Marvel to resolve. And because Carlos's counterspells are so much more mana intensive than Matt's, it will allow Matt to set up a turn where he's getting that mana advantage in the counter war, and turn 5 is really the key turn where he'd love to do that. An additional copy of Negate there as well. I think those are the 5 cards we'll see him bring in. Glimmer of Genius is also a card he may bring in. Part of his game plan might be to play a little bit of a more long, drawn-out game where he's drawing extra cards, filtering a little bit more, and trying to set up a threat plus a counterspell.
Is there something to be said for Ceremonious Rejection here? Obviously, it looks like it doesn't have a lot of things it can counter, but those Void Shatters, they're colorless spells. So he could, in principle, if he thinks that he's got a lot of air in his deck after game 1 and 2, bring those in as well to deal with them. They also, they're just sort of another way of saying, I can resolve my key threat.
He could in principle. It is true that it does interact with Void Shatter. I would not expect him to bring that card in. The thing with a combo deck is that you can't change too many cards post-sideboard or else the engine of your deck stops working, right? He still needs to maintain the Marvels, the Eldrazi, enough ways to gather energy and enough ways to find the Marvel. So my bet is that we'll probably see the Dispels and the Negate come in for sure, and then maybe some number of copies of Glimmer of Genius, depending on how Matt wants to run this post-board.
Okay, cool. Let's have a look at what Carlos Romao has going on, because we heard Matt Nass lamenting the fact that he was going to have to play against a Spell Queller deck regardless. Here we can see where the Spell Quellers reside for Carlos Romao. 3 copies of those in the sideboard. Now, on this side of things, Ceremonious Rejection has to be pretty good, right?
Yes, absolutely. Ceremonious Rejection for sure will be coming in for Carlos Romao with the perfect card to copy or to counter both Aetherworks Marvel, or can also counter a big Eldrazi in a pinch, although it still will let that cast trigger resolve. The biggest card, as you mentioned, Tim, is Spell Queller. Just the perfect card here. It comes in even on the draw. It's in time to answer Aetherworks Marvel. It counters a spell converted mana cost 4 or less, kind of, perfectly engineered to answer that 4 mana cost Aetherworks Marvel. And it also adds a little bit of pressure to Carlos's board. As we saw in the first couple games, Carlos's deck is pretty slow to win, and so chipping away for that early damage can actually close out the game before, Matt can draw into multiple Eldrazi. Negate, of course, also coming in as well.
Fantastic stuff. Well, the players, they've been sat waiting to play this next game while we had our third game on the other side of things. Let's head down and see whether or not Matt Nass can turn things around with his sideboard. Matt Nass, of course, on the play here. And the pressure's on for him. He's 2 games down, so he does need to win 3 on the bounce if he's going to advance to the semifinals. Kicks things off within a tune with Ether and finds an island. As we said in the previous games, this is a matchup where looking at the board, not necessarily the way that you can tell who's winning, looking at the life totals, looking at the energy count, that's not what it's all about. Let's take a look at Matt Nass's hand. He already has a Dispel. He already has a little bit of a way of generating energy. Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger, though, that one of the worst draws in his deck.
It is indeed. It's extremely unlikely that he'll ever get to the point in the game where he can hard cast an Ulamog, as we say, from his hand. So it's largely a dead card, but that's sort of what you sign up for this with this deck. Sometimes you draw into your Eldrazi, but there's still plenty more in the deck. Matt Nass's hand shaping up pretty decently here. He's got a Dispel. Really just needs to find Aetherworks Marvel and continue hitting his land drops.
Now, looking across at the other side of things, we have Void Shatter, we have Stasis Snare, we have Archangel Avacyn to present a little bit of pressure, but unlike in Game 1, where a hand with Void Shatter just feels like it's the earth and everything on it, here there's a lot more worry for Carlos Romao about actually making sure that that counter magic is going to be good enough.
Yeah, Carlos's hand looking decent from his point of view. He has a counterspell. Stasis Snare, also a very relevant card in that it can deal with Emrakul, although the cast trigger will still go off. So, Carlos feeling about as decent as he can in this position. Of course, he knows about the Dispels that Matt Nass has access to and will be worrying about those. But, you just gotta play with what you have, and at least having 1 counterspell is a great start for Carlos Romao.
So here we see the puzzle not being activated for Matt Nass. A little bit more scrying going on. He gets to dig deeper to try and find his key threats. And as previously noted, this is the round where he's going to be looking to go off on turn 5 rather than 4, given that he has those 2 Dispels in hand.
Yeah, it's especially important that Matt sort of waits and paces things out a little bit more in this game, because we talked about Carlos having a limited number of counterspells in the first game. Now Carlos has many, many more. He's adding, I believe, 3 Spell Quellers, 3 Ceremonious Rejections, and a Negate. So that's 7 more counterspells on top of the 5 that he had in Game 1, totaling 12, plus the Torrential Gearhulks as well.
Yeah, a very classic control deck once we come after sideboard for Carlos Romao. I mean, if you look at something like the original The Deck, it was basically a whole bunch of counter magic and removal and then 1 or 2 win conditions. The thing that Romao has going for him is that actually some of his win conditions also function as counter magic.
So one other card I'd love to highlight here in Matt Nass's hand is that Glimmer of Genius in the sideboard. He has 4 copies in his sideboard. Looks to me like he may have actually brought in the whole package of all 4 of them, or at least some number of them. And what's so great about that card is it allows Matt Nass to get incremental advantage as the game goes a little bit longer. And as we talked about, his game plan now is no longer to race to the Marvel, unless he sees a particular obvious opening, but rather he's going to play a little bit of a longer game and try to sculpt his hand. And often we see combo decks do this, especially in post-sideboard games against control decks, where they want to sculpt their hand and get the perfect tools that they need to have one big turn where they play their threatening combo piece and then force it through with 1 or more counter spells to back it up.
So pre-sideboard, it's about winning fast. Post-sideboard, it's just about winning.
It's about winning, but it's about sculpting your hand for the perfect turn.
All right, so do not think for a moment, folks, that while we watch these games, just because there have not been permanents placed on the battlefield aside from lands, that there's not a lot of action going on. Each of these players will be pretty familiar with what their role is here, and at some point, I would not be surprised to see a number of spells on the stack.
Yes.
And that number greater than 2.
Yep. So far, we're not quite there, although I am taking a look at Matt Nass's hand here, switching things over for you at home, and it looks like he's picked up a copy of Aetherworks Marvel, so here he goes for it. This is that turn where he's decided to pull the trigger. Down comes Spell Queller for Carlos Romao, and unfortunately for Matt Nass, he had 2 copies of Dispel there. He was counting on Carlos Romao having maybe a Void Shatter or maybe even Void Shatter plus Ceremonious Rejection, and those Dispels would have covered his bases there. Unfortunately, Spell Queller being the perfect answer in that it cannot be hit by Dispel. It is not an instant, it's a creature.
I must admit, I mean, if you think back to when Carlos Romao won the World Championship, he was playing a deck featuring the actual card counterspell. Blue, counter-target spell. I love the fact that we've kind of moved in a direction where if you want to counter anything, it costs a little bit more, and we have these now conditional counter spells that make building control decks a little bit more complicated, but more rewarding if you get it right.
Yeah, it's a great point, Tim. Totally agree. So, Matt doing his best here to recover, leading off with an Attune with Ether. And this is where we really see that sideboard plan of adding in those glimmers of genius, kind of giving Matt Nass the capability to get a second round of action coming up. He does have a couple of copies of Contingency Plan here to help him dig as well. So, you know, Matt, what's going on in Matt's mind now is, okay, you had the Spell Queller, you know, I tried for it, you had it, but, you know, now we need to prepare for round 2, and I'll make you have it again.
So here comes Contingency Plan. Dig for Matthew Nass here. Now, if we're expecting games to go a tiny bit longer after sideboarding, and I think it sounds like there's a potential for that, are we looking at it being more likely to actually be able to cast something like Ulamog?
We are indeed, and I would say it's not necessarily that the games are going to go longer, because Carlos actually has brought in a little bit more in terms of win conditions between the Spell Quellers and the Archangel Avacins. What I will say, and this is strange, is that the games will go longer and Matt will still have more of a chance to win than the pre-sideboarded games. And part of that is, again, having those Dispels as backup for his threats. And, you know, also, as you said, Tim, being able to potentially resolve an Eldrazi later on. You know, even, you know, if things shake out in the right way, an Eldrazi with Dispel backup.
Interesting stuff. Yeah, I mean, I guess that if you had to draw a graph of likelihood to win by turn in games 1 and 2 here, pre-sideboard, once it got past about turn 6 or so, it went massively in favor of Carlos Romao. That not as obviously the case in these sideboarded games.
Yeah, I think actually in a strange way, Matt's, comparing post-sideboard to pre-sideboard, Matt's chances to win earlier in the game go down because Carlos has brought in more early counterspells, but Matt's chances later on in the game actually go up compared to where it was pre-sideboard. I think overall, Matt's chances do go down, but, you know, as we said before, both decks capable of getting a lot more interaction post-sideboard. So it's not completely clear to me that the post-sideboard games are a lot worse for Matt Nass. I think they're a little bit worse, but there's still some game to be had there.
Well, Carlos Romao deciding that he doesn't want to leave things too late here, gets down Archangel Avacyn and starts crunching in with both the Legendary Angel and Spell Queller. Did not really cost him too much there, of course, because the Archangel has Flash. He was able to put it into play at end of turn. Looks on as Contingency Plan comes from Matt Nass. Now, I guess one of the things that is a more nuanced element to this deck, which I'm sure Matt Nass is well familiar with, is keeping track of which cards you've bottomed with scries and so on, getting a feel for roughly where the Eldrazi may lie in your deck. It may be that even though you have X cards in your deck, that there could be a whole bunch of Eldrazi sat on the bottom because you've stuck them there with previous effects.
Yeah, that's definitely true. You do get more information about what is left in your deck and where it might be as you continue scrying and putting cards into your graveyard with Contingency Plan. And you can see, you know, Matt has a pretty large graveyard by now. So he's got a good picture of what's left in his deck and what he can draw into. And of note, you know, he hasn't drawn too many Eldrazi, but I'll actually stop that thought for now. He's going for another Aetherworks Marvel here with 2 Dispels in his hand. This could be a crucial turn. Let's see what happens.
Now, it looks like there is the option at a Spell Queller here for Carlos Romao, but he kicks things off with a negate. That meets Dispel. Now, what might the motivation be to play the negate here rather than the Spell Queller to begin with?
I actually think Carlos is happy getting Dispels out of Matt Nass's hand whenever he can. You know, he knows about their existence because they see each other's deck lists. And, you know, I think he has a feeling that Matt has drawn some by now, and that's part of the reason he's going for it. And the reason Carlos wants to make this trade of negate for Dispel right now is if he doesn't, then he constantly needs to leave open a whole bunch of mana so that he can have a back-and-forth counter war each turn and always be worrying about Matt Nass going for it whenever he taps low. But by making this trade now, he's exchanging those resources, and then they're permanently removed from the equation. And he knows that as a backup resort, he can always go for the Spell Queller in the end, which can't be dispelled. So Carlos right now is thinking about, does he want to make another one of these one-for-one trades where he Void Shatters back and allows Matt to dispel it if Matt has the dispel, and then finally follows up with Spell Queller, but perceives a little bit of a risk there just in case things go wrong along the way, and wants to go for the Spell Queller right now.
Now, that's an additional choice, of course. Do you Spell Queller the counter magic or the original spell?
I definitely go for the original spell there, because if he tries to play Spell Queller on the Dispel and Matt has a second Dispel, then Matt can let the Spell Queller resolve, take away the first Dispel, then play a second Dispel on the negate, and then that would, you know, force Carlos to have another counterspell from there. And I think he wants to hold on to that Void Shatter as long as possible. The other thing Carlos is thinking about is, what if at some point in the game Emrakul comes out or even Ulamog comes out, either of which could lead to a sequence where those Spell Quellers actually die, and that would give Matt Nass back those Aetherworks Marvels. So he's just thinking carefully about the sequencing and leaving himself with a counterspell, as well as being careful about what he's hiding under those Spell Quellers. But I like the decisions that he's made there, and Matt Nass agrees that there is no way out from this situation, and Carlos Romao will take that match 3-0.
Well, it turns out that having a warm-up of quarterfinal 1 is proving very, very good for the players that won them, because both Carlos Romao and Ben Hull just rattling off 3 games in a row. Our quarterfinal 2s moving at a fantastic pace there, and that meaning that we have our semi-finals pretty much lined up. I would imagine that in terms of the players that were sort of trying to figure out what they were going to play against, it was a little bit of a sweat. They obviously will have had preferences based on matchups and so on. I know, for example, that Shota Yasuoka was very worried about the likes of having to play against a blue-red deck, but we have our semi-final set. We're going to get a chance to see them soon enough. But first, let's head back to the news desk.
Thank you very much to Tim Willoughby there with the final words of the quarterfinals. Stage 1 is done, Stage 2 is done. Rich Hagan alongside Brian David Marshall and Luis Scott Vargas. Welcome into the studio. It is lunchtime here in Honolulu, so we are about 35 minutes away from the first semi-final. We've got a ton of great stuff coming your way. In a little while, we are going to take you inside the Hall of Fame ceremony. And Brian David Marshall, I know that's one of your favorite events of the year. Was it a good one this time around?
Yeah, it was great. I mean, it was a great class. A great crop of existing Hall of Famers who show up to welcome the new members into the fold, and it's just always a really good time. And we got to see how well Luis dances, and that's always pretty exciting.
Don't do that. Please don't do that. I'm not going to unsee that in a hurry.
In fact, you could make a clip of it on Twitch if you really want to see that.
Oh, stop.
Stop.
It just gets worse and worse.
PT top dances.
You are terrible. I don't know how I control them. Anyway, you'll see that Hall of Fame ceremony in a little bit. Also, we're going to take you inside R&D in Seattle. And we will, of course, preview that first semi-final for you. But if you're just joining us, let's take a look at what's happened today so far. Let's open up our top 8 bracket here at Pro Tour Kaladesh and walk you through. Now, it does look a little bit different again, because remember, the 5 through 8 seeds had to win 4 matches today. The 3 and 4 seeds needed to win 3, and the 1 and 2 seeds have yet to play. They're straight through to the semi-finals, courtesy of their outstanding finishes in the main rounds on Friday and Saturday. So how did it all pan out? Let's start off with Carlos Romao against Joey Manor. This was Jeskai Control against White Blue Flash. Luis, what happened?
Carlos pulled out a pretty close match. He was able to get a lot more torrential gear hooks into play and stabilize the board, and Joey was never able to close out the games.
So Carlos Romao advanced to the second stage of the quarterfinals. So he then would go on to face Matt Nass. In the bottom half of the bracket, Ben Hull with red-white vehicles, the 34-year-old Canadian in his first Pro Tour and first Pro Tour top 8, of course, against the 5-time top 8 man, Li Shichan. They were both playing vehicles BDM, and Ben liked his matchup on paper, but not on the human side because Lee's such a great player.
Sure.
How did it work?
Yeah, obviously had a ton of respect for the 5 top 8s for Li Shitian, but you know, the cleaner, leaner, red-white vehicles deck was able to, you know, frankly, run over Li Shitian.
Yeah, so 3-1 to Ben Hull, so that put him into stage 2, and he would face Pierre Dajon there. Well, up at the top of your screen, Carlos Romao, having beaten Joey Manor, now faced Matt Nass. And Luis, sometimes magic works out just the way it's supposed to, and Matt Nass will not be happy about that fact.
No, Matt was not predicting a win. None of us predicted a win for Matt Nass, and unfortunately, he also did not win.
Yeah, it was a straight sweep. Carlos Romao with Jeskai control past team at Aetherworks. Basically, whenever Matt Nass needed to do something important, Carlos Romao said, more importantly, you can't. And so Carlos Romao advances to the semi-finals. And then in the bottom half of the bracket, this was Pierre Dajon entering as the 3rd seed, so his first match in the top 8 with blue-red spells against the red-white vehicles of Ben Hull. And I guess we thought this one would be tighter than it was, BDM.
Yeah, absolutely, but you really saw why this is a deck you want to play, the red-white vehicles deck, because if there's any kind of stumble or any type of, you know, slow to develop board state, that deck is just absolutely brutally punishing, and that's kind of what happened in that matchup, and Ben won 3, you know, pretty quick games there.
He really did. So Ben Hull goes through to the semi-finals. So our semi-finals are set. They will go consecutively, so no longer we're down to just one table after lunch. So we will begin with Carlos Romao with Jeskai control against Makis Matsoukas, the first timer here from Greece, not just his first Pro Tour top 8, his first Pro Tour full stop, period. Great stuff to see him the #1 seed. And when they are done with their best 3 out of 5, Shota Yasuoka, Showtime, will enter the top 8 bracket, the #2 seed against Ben Hull, who was already defeated Li Shichan and Pierre Dajon en route just to have the right to play against Shota Yasuoka in the semi-finals. So that's the afternoon coming your way here at Pro Tour Kaladesh. Right now, though, we're going to send you away from the exotica of Honolulu to the slightly more mundane, just a little bit, Renton, Washington. But something very special happens there, because that is, of course, the home of Wizards of the Coast. And we got to go inside R&D with all the guys and girls who bring you your favorite game. So here's the 3rd part of Inside R&D.
Great setting? Check. Great characters? Check. Great stories? Check. But Magic players know for a truly great set, you need truly great mechanics too. Does Kaladesh deliver? Check, check, and check. Check it out.
So one of my goals was I wanted to have a higher variance of play, meaning if you took the exact same deck and played many matches with it, that the games would play out differently, more so than the average game of Magic. And the key to doing that has to do with synergy. It has to do with making mechanics that allow you to make choices where you shift in different directions over different games. And we managed to find a couple mechanics that did exactly that.
So Kaladesh is a world of wondrous inventions, and a lot of the artifacts on Kaladesh are powered by a new resource called energy. Now in Kaladesh, the card set, you're going to see lots of cards that give you energy counters. Energy is completely interchangeable. One card can give you energy counters, and then you can spend those counters on the ability of a different card. Remember, the counters go on you. They're not attached to the card that gave you the energy. They don't sit in some weird zone. They're just counters that are on you, the player.
Okay, so our story begins back in Mirrodin, original Mirrodin. So I was working with artifacts, and I was trying to figure out a way to sort of what are artifacts? They run off something. And so I was trying to play around with mechanics that dealt with what was the energy that ran the artifacts. And it was inspired by the idea of cards like serrated arrows, where you only had so many uses of them. So I said, well, what if you had cards like that, but let's say you had serrated arrows and then other card like serrated arrows. What if instead of serrated arrows you can only use it 3 times, and this other card you can only use it 3 times? What if between them you could use it 6? That was the inspiration for energy.
Having energy in Kaladesh opens up a lot of really interesting design space. For example, there might be some activated ability you want to put on a creature that doesn't cost mana, but it has to cost something. Sometimes we do it with life, but that doesn't go on cards of all colors. Energy is something we can give you a activated ability on a creature without mana. You can use repeatedly, but not indefinitely. So you have this finite resource that you can use to give creatures extra abilities.
So the really cool thing about energy is you can get energy from a lot of different cards and spend it however you choose. So a challenge in developing energy was making sure there wasn't one card you always wanted to shift all your energy into. If you play 3 cards out and you're only ever using one of them, and that happens game after game after game, clearly the energy economy is messed up a little bit. We put a lot of time into making sure that no matter how you played your energy cards, you would find opportunities to use each of their abilities in different instances.
One of the challenges with developing energy, especially for constructed play, is energy cards play really well with each other, but there are no other energy cards anywhere else in Standard, for example, or throughout Magic's history. So we wanted to avoid a situation where energy cards only played well with each other and sort of forced you to build this all-energy deck and not to mix in any other cards from the surrounding sets. So what we tried to do was aim little packages of energy cards, maybe 3 or 4 energy cards you might play in 3 or 4 copies, and they work together and you can interchange the energy between them to make them a little bit more versatile, but it wasn't as if you had to play all energy cards just to power up this one energy outlet. So a good example of an energy package that I like to think of is a package of Harnessed Lightning, Voltaic Brawler, Lathian Hellion, and Bristling Hydra. And these 4 cards together form sort of a core package that you might turn into, say, a red-green energy beatdown deck, for example.
So one of the neat things about energy that really plays in the larger theme of the set, let's take Minister of Inquirers. It's a card that with energy you can mill your opponent. So sometimes you get that card and the strategy is in this game, I have a slow game or I'm going to mill my opponent up. That's what I'm doing. And so I'm taking my energy and that's my energy is getting focused this game. But lots of other games, maybe that's not what you're doing. In fact, the Minister gives you energy and you use it for a different purpose. Like one of the neat things about energy is really how you use it from game to game can radically change. And so even though you have the same cards, the strategy from game to game can be radically different.
We look at what are some etherpunk or steampunk style tropes, and you can't really talk about that without talking about vehicles. We want airships racing through the skies. We want interesting wheeled vehicles or walkers, going through the streets. And we knew pretty quickly that this was the place to deploy vehicles.
If energy is the cake of Kaladesh, vehicles are the icing. We have known for a long time there is a great deal of exciting space in designing vehicles, and we think our fans are going to really enjoy what we've come up with here.
So Kaladesh introduces an exciting new type of artifact called vehicles. Vehicles start out as just artifacts, but you'll notice they each have a power and toughness. That's because it has an ability called Crew that lets it become an artifact creature until the end of the turn. Now to crew a vehicle, find the crew number, and then you need to tap creatures you control with total power equal to or greater than that number.
So one of the really interesting thing about vehicles in general is there were so many knobs and so many things we played around with. Like, it's very funny, like, energy started, and we knew what energy did, and there's a lot of balancing the energy and figuring out how to use energy, but what energy was when we started design and finished design, almost identical. But vehicles just went through radical changes because we were constantly trying to figure out what's the best way to do this. We knew creatures were tied to it, we knew there was some crewing involved, but what exactly, when they became creatures, when they stopped becoming creatures, how you activated them, all that, just iteration by iteration, trying to figure that out.
Once you get your creatures in there, a lot of them are offering huge amounts of power, even at very low rarities, that you're getting things that are just going to be bigger than your biggest creature on the board, because elves all got in the train, and the train can smash really hard.
Sky Sovereign, console flagship. We knew in the very, very early stages we wanted a great, great airship. Of course, we're on Kaladesh, it's this Aetherpunk world. There are airships around, so we made an awesome one, a big legendary airship you could play with.
Kaladesh was my first design team, and I'm incredibly proud of what we've done. I think that we will see some of our work, especially on vehicles, last throughout the remaining history of the game.
So Fabricate is a cool new ability you'll find on some creature cards in Kaladesh. There's a number after Fabricate, and when a creature with Fabricate enters the battlefield, you have a choice. You can either put that many +1/+1 counters on the creature, or you can create that many 1/1 colorless servo artifact creature tokens.
Something we're a big fan of in R&D is creating divergent gameplay, where you do something, and depending on the situation, you'll do it differently. And Fabricate is a great example of this, where you might have the same limited deck, but over the course of 3 matches, you might choose different modes depending on what the situation is, and you never know what you're going to choose when you draw the card. It's at that specific moment when you play it, you have to figure out, what do I want here?
Let's take the 3 mechanics from the set. Imagine they were siblings. Okay, so we got energy, we got vehicles, and we have Fabricate. I think like Fabricate is like, it's got to watch its older siblings that kind of get all the limelight. You know, like energy has a brand new mana symbol and just does things we've never done before. And vehicle is like, finally, after years that people asked, we finally delivered. And poor little Fabricate is like, you know, like it's the workhorse mechanic, you know, tying things together and doing a lot of really good work, but like just watching its older siblings get all the attention. And so I just want to say, like, poor little Fabricate, like, one of the things that I love about the set is, like, Fabricate, which is, like, in my mind, like, the least splashy mechanic, is a great mechanic. Like it is a really cool, fun, flavorful, like, inventive, like, it is a neat, cool mechanic. And that is, like, the least splashy mechanic.
We really want players through Kaladesh to feel like inventors themselves. That was a real driving question at the end of every playtest. We'd ask people, do you feel like an inventor? Did you feel like you had the opportunity to build something unique?
So one of the things, we're talking a lot about mechanics. We're talking all about, you know, what energy is and what vehicles are and what Fabricate is. There's another thing we did, which is make awesome artifacts. Like one of the things that I gave to my team, I said, we want to have a lot of individually cool artifacts. You want to be an inventor, you want to have that feel. I want to make sure that I'm giving you lots of artifacts that just individual cards go, I'm going to build a deck around that. You know, this set was meant to be Johnny-rific. It's a set where I really want to fuel imaginations. I want people to go, ooh, I see that one card, and wow, I have ideas. And so we weren't just making mechanics, we were making an awesome, awesome Aetherpunk set.
So there's a lot of cool interactions, a lot of open-ended combos cards in the set. One of the more direct representation of this is the cycle of 3 modules. The 3 artifacts, animation module, decoction module, and fabrication module, that all have an input that feeds into the next one. So the animation module will take +1/+1 counters and give you creatures, while the decoction module wants creatures to give you energy. And of course, the fabrication module brings it back to the beginning. It wants energy and it gives you +1/+1 counters. So like, if you remember like the stations from Mirrodin, that was this like really convoluted 4-card cycle. We kind of did something in that space. We have these 3 cards and they do this really powerful thing. Once you get all 3 of them together, and gives this really Johnny feel to the set.
Combo sort of has this perception that it's like a dirty word among game bounce developer type minded people, and that's not entirely true. It means we have to be more careful when we're creating combinations or leaving the possibility that combinations might arise. With Kaladesh, we made a very conscious effort that we would have more combo type cards that have sort of open-ended possibilities and give you sort of option to do big splashy things if you combine them in the right way. And going into that intentionally meant that we were putting more effort on those cards, testing them out a lot, testing a lot of combination decks in our future league, and you know, generally leaving them there, but making sure that we had a good understanding of how they work, and hopefully ending up in a good spot where things are exciting but won't break the game in half.
I really like to have each set create a feel that's uniquely its own. And one of the neat things about this set is when you play it, when you're actually in Kaladesh and playing with the cards, that it is unlike anything else. That it is a set that really has its own very clear identity to it, not just flavorfully, because it has a very flavorful identity, but mechanically. And that one of the things that when you actually get to play with the cards, one of the things that to me, like really endears the set to me, is how distinctive it is and how much it has a mechanical feel that is very much all its own.
Tezzeret? Tezzeret? He can't get away with this, surely. I guess we'll find out next time when Kaladesh becomes home to an Aether Revolt. But until we meet again on Inside R&D, for everyone here at Wizards of the Coast, I'm your host, Rich Hagan, saying bye.
And again, thank you so much to all the people at Wizards of the Coast who give so freely of their time to give you that access to what really goes on in the making of each new set. Can't wait to get behind Aether Revolt later on. But there we are, that's Inside R&D. Well, next up, coming your way in a little while, is going to be semi-final one. Just to remind you of the stakes here, Carlos Romao will face Makis Matsoukas, the #1 seed of Greece. And then Ben Hull, who fought his way through 2 rounds already, he will face Shota Yasuoka. That'll be our second semi-final. We're running them one at a time. You'll see every turn of every game. But right now, it's time to wind the clock back to earlier in the week when the Hall of Fame came to Honolulu, and 2 tremendous players being honoured with the greatest honour in the game, becoming part of that fraternity, if you will, in the Hall of Fame. Owen Turtenwald, Yuya Watanabe. It was a lovely ceremony. You're going to see that now, and then we'll settle in for the semi-final. See you in just a little bit.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends and family, Hall of Famers, tournament officials, and key Wizards personnel, welcome to the induction ceremony for the 2016 class of the Magic the Gathering Pro Tour Hall of Fame. I'm Brian David Marshall. I'm the Pro Tour historian, and one of my jobs is to oversee this ceremony every year, and it's one of the great pleasures that I have working on the Pro Tour to do this. And it's always amazing to see such a concentration, well, theoretically I can see you, to see such a great concentration of the best players from throughout the history of the game gathered in one spot to welcome new members into your fold. This year's class of the Hall of Fame is small, but both players have made the most of their decade on the Pro Tour. They are both on a very short list of multiple-time Player of the Year winners, a list that includes only them and Kai Buddha. Like Kai, they have achieved single name recognition status as well. They are 2 of the most intimidating opponents to sit across the table from, with stern game faces, but they also have 2 of the most radiant smiles on the Pro Tour when they're hanging out with their family and friends. They love to play the game the right way, and they love the people they play the game with. Both players are entering into the Hall of Fame in their first year of eligibility, and it hardly seems like it can be 10 years since they debuted. I have distinct memories of first becoming aware of both of these players before their first Pro Tour appearances. I will leave it to you to figure out which story pertains to which player. Back when Japan was first showing themselves to be a Magic superpower, I would often check in with Japanese coverage reporter Keita Mori about the new faces on the Japanese Magic scene. He told me of a promising top 2 competitor from the finals, a prestigious Japanese year-end standard event, who had qualified multiple times for the Pro Tour, but had chosen not to go. He was not sure he was ready to wade into battle against the likes of John Finkel and Kai Buddha. Plus, he was only in high school at the time. The other I first became aware of midway through day 1 of Grand Prix Columbus in 2007, when he played against my good friend Steve Sadin. Steve had been away from Magic for a while and was playing a complicated legacy format Flash Hulk deck. And he had won multiple rounds just by playing Protean Hulk off of Flash and having his opponents concede without making him go through the motions. But he hadn't played with the deck very much and really didn't know how it worked. He played against his future Hall of Famer, put Protean Hulk into play, put it in the graveyard, and kind of waited for his opponent to concede. And he said, "How about you show me how the combo works first?" Steve didn't win that match. It really does seem like it was just yesterday. And ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, it is my profound pleasure to introduce to you the 2016 class of the Magic the Gathering Pro Tour Hall of Fame. The United States' Owen Turtenwald made his Pro Tour debut at PT Valencia 2007. He was playing for top 8 in the late rounds and finished 18th to start his Hall of Fame career. He was coming off a finals appearance at Grand Prix Columbus, the first of a dizzying 21 Grand Prix top 8 finishes.
He's definitely one of probably 5 or 6 people that when I sit across from him, I I feel outclassed, you know, and that's rare. But he's just very good at playing the games, choosing decks, drafting. He's just a well-rounded player.
His Grand Prix dominance is highlighted by 4 wins, including back-to-back weekends in Washington, D.C. and Albuquerque, and a win alongside Reed Duke and William Jensen as Peach Garden Oath. Enter the Battlefield, a documentary that featured Turtenwald, chronicled his determination to succeed and the friendship that is the backbone of Peach Garden Oath.
I've had the good fortune to play Team Grand Prix alongside Owen, and I can tell you there's no safer, more secure feeling than knowing that Owen is playing your deciding match for you. We even won Grand Prix Portland in 2014 together as a team.
In 2011, buoyed by a record-setting 7 Grand Prix top 8 finishes, Turtenwald sat alone atop the Pro Field as the Player of the Year. His first of 4 Pro Tour top 8s came during Pro Tour Gatecrash, but none of them were more memorable than him squeaking into the elimination rounds of Pro Tour Magic 2015 on the narrowest of tiebreakers.
He sort of had himself convinced he was out of it. He had gone 12-4 and it was going to be on tiebreakers, but everybody was telling him Jeremy Desani was going to get in. And his reaction when Scott called him in 8th place of galloping up to the we call it the Seabiscuit, that's what we refer to it now. Owen galloping up to the stage, screaming, gave me a big hug. That's probably my favorite memory of Owen on the Pro Tour.
Incredibly, we may still not have seen the best of Turtenwald.
I mean, he's been the best player in Magic for probably about the last 3 years or so. You know, there aren't really very many people in the history of Magic, you know, they can claim to be sort of the consensus best player in Magic. You know, Owen's one of, you know, maybe a half dozen people who have that claim.
Just this past season, the Team Pantheon member made the finals of the World Championship.
Played him in the semifinals of the World Championships last year, and you know, I felt like that was my tournament. You know what I mean? I felt like that was the one that I was going to win. And it wasn't very long into game 1 before I started to get some second thoughts, you know, that he's the kind of guy who can make you second guess and lose your self-confidence very quickly because of how assured he is and how much he knows exactly what's going to happen.
He also notched his 4th Pro Tour top 8 and earned his 2nd Player of the Year title, putting him in an elite class of players to win that trophy twice.
This year, Owen had close to the best season any Magic player has ever had.
Ladies and gentlemen, from the United States, Owen Turtenwald.
So I wrote this speech on the flight here. I didn't know what I was going to say until it was in the forefront of my mind, but I'm going to say, recently in tournament coverage and on social media, I've had the opportunity to see newer, younger players say that they looked up to me. They wanted to emulate what I did, both because I was a really good player and because of the way that I treated my opponents and the way that I conducted myself. So for me, that was an especially meaningful compliment to receive. And I also wanted to thank everyone who's here today, Magic players who are playing in the Pro Tour tomorrow, who are sacrificing the time that they could be spent preparing. They want to spend that time here honoring me and my family, who also made a sacrifice of their time to fly really far and see this happen. That's pretty amazing as well. Magic the Gathering is the best thing that's ever happened to me. Playing a lot of Magic taught me the meaning of ambition, dedication, sportsmanship, hard work, and self-confidence. I want to especially thank Reed Duke, William Jensen, Brock Parker, Luis Scott Vargas, John Finkel, and every member of the Pantheon. Not only are all you guys world-class Magic players, but you've each helped me become a better player and a better person. I'm being inducted today in large part because of my achievements in tournaments. And I'm certain without each one of you guys that those achievements would have never happened. The friendships I've made are incredible, and the people I've mentioned are the most generous, kind-hearted, good-natured people, decent human beings that I've ever met. I'm extremely fortunate and grateful to be in this position, and I hope that everyone is able to find something in their life that gives them as much satisfaction and fulfillment that Magic has given me. Thank you.
Japan's Yuya Watanabe debuted at Pro Tour Yokohama in 2007 after winning Grand Prix Kyoto to qualify. He had trepidation about playing at the Pro Tour level, but once he got there, he not only succeeded beyond his own expectations, but thrived.
僕、渡辺さんの後発のプレイヤーということで、渡辺さんの背中を見て育ってきたような形ですね。渡辺さんのそのプレイヤーとしてのそのプレイングスキルだったり、ドラフトの技術だったりとかを近場で教えてもらったりとかして非常に感謝していますし、プロプレイヤーとしてのその紳士的な立ち振る舞いとかもすごい参考になるところが多いなと思っていますんで。
Despite a modest finish at that PT, he would end that debut season as the 2007 Rookie of the Year.
グランプリ優勝から例えばね中村修平さんと一緒にチーム戦というかトゥーヘッドジャイアントですかね一緒に出て彼とそのルーキーを取るために頑張るってことだったり、それ以降はプレイヤーオブジイヤーですか取ったり。
He would complement that trophy with a Player of the Year trophy in 2009 on the back of his first Pro Tour Top 8 at PT Austin.
2009年の日本選手権の後かな、彼と僕とで決勝戦を戦ったのですが、その後僕の家でずっと M10 のシールドを2人で遊んでたんですよ。でその1ヶ月後くらいかな、リミテッドの GP があったのですが、そこから彼がめちゃくちゃ勝ち出して気がついたらそれが1年間続いて彼が POI になったっていうそれがもう印象的ですね。
Over the last decade, Watanabe made the top 8 of 24 Grand Prix with a total of 6 wins.
2012, I think, Yuya Watanabe just won every single GP in Asia. We among the Asian players play group, we have a hashtag for never beat Yuya because he just won 3 Asia GP in a row. So.
At the Pro Tour, he reached the top 8 2 more times, including a finals finish at Pro Tour Return to Ravnica, but there were more trophies on his horizon. Watanabe joined Kai Buda as the only players at the time to win the Player of the Year trophy more than once, when he repeated at the end of the 2011-2012 season.
He passes, to me, the biggest test for a prospective Hall of Famer, which is when the best players in the world go to the pairings board and they look across and see who they're going to play, and they see Yuya, they say, oh no, not Yuya, anybody else but Yuya. He consistently outplays the best players in the world and has done so for the last 5-7 years.
He won the first ever Players' Championship, defeating countryman and fellow Hall of Famer Shota Yasuoka in the finals.
I remember that Shota Yasuoka, another Hall of Famer, destroyed the tournament. He had like 1 loss, everyone else had 5. And then Yuya finally stopped him in the finals and became the first new world champion in a year in which he had already effectively been the Player of the Year. He had the most pro points. So that was really, I think, his crowning achievement. He was basically world champion twice that year.
Consistency and dominance have been the hallmarks of his career, and over the last half a decade, he is the only player to compete in all 5 of Magic's elite World Championship tournaments.
今回は世界選手権のイベントの会場でこの話してるんですけれども、彼だけがこの5年間連続世界選手権個人戦参加されているってことも素晴らしいです。だからやっぱり日本を代表するプレイヤーっていうのは思います。
Ladies and gentlemen, from Japan, Yuya Watanabe.
It's like a difficult game. That's what I thought when I first heard about Magic. Then I played it and thought this game is challenging, complex and fun, little by little. I was completely drawn under its spell. I have been under the spell of Magic for 16 years now. It is no longer just a game to me. It has been my best friend for more than half of my life. It's been my side through all my good times and all my bad times. I cannot imagine my life without it. Today, I feel a deep sense and a pride and achievement in receiving this great honor. However, it won't stop me from working to become a better player. I will not stop until the day I get the Pro Tour trophy. I would like to thank the greatest game Magic and all its fans. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the 2016 class of the Magic the Gathering Pro Tour Hall of Fame.
Hope you enjoyed that. Owen Turtenwald and Yuya Watanabe, the new members of the Magic the Gathering Pro Tour Hall of Fame. Luis, it's always special when you welcome someone into the club. Special memories for you too, for sure.
Yeah, it was an awesome induction ceremony. The speeches were great.
Yeah, and again, we forget just how many players go out of their way to speak to us and to you in English, in a language that is not necessarily their own. I know a ton of work went in to Shota Yasuoka last year and Yuya Watanabe to speak to us directly in English, and we really do appreciate that. It's, you know, we're pretty honoured that they would choose to do that for us. So thank you to both of them and congratulations again. The class of 2016, Owen Turtenwald and Yuya Watanabe. All right, so from here down the stretch, it is all about the top 8 here at Pro Tour Kaladesh. Luis Scott Vargas, the Hall of Famer, of course, is here. So why don't we take a look at our bracket, show you where we've got to here on lunchtime on our final day. We had 2 stages of quarterfinals, remember, because that was the new system. 5 through 8 had to play stage 1. The winners advanced to face the 3 and 4 seeds in the second stage of quarterfinal action. And that leads us to a semi-final lineup that features Shota Yasuoka with Grixis Control against Ben Hull with his red-white vehicles. That's going to be semi-final 2, but we are going to focus in on semi-final 1. Carlos Romao with Jeskai Control. He's advanced all the way from quarterfinal stage 1, and awaiting him is the number 1 seed, Makis Matsoukas of Greece. So why don't we take a look at Makis for you. Here he is, as we say, he's from Greece, he's 25 years old, 4 lifetime pro points. That $575 is going to rattle up as a result of this finish, another 5 figures going into his bank account. It's his first Pro Tour top 8. Of course it is. It's his first Pro Tour, full stop. So congratulations to him for making it this far. Because he's the number 1 seed, he gets to start his campaign here in the semi-finals. Let's take a look at his deck. It is red, white tokens. Luis, what is he planning on doing here?
This is a much more aggressive version of the red-white deck than we've seen in some of the other players play, like Ben Hull, for example, with the standout really being 4 copies of Reckless Bushwhacker, which combined with Servo Exhibition, 1-drops like Thraben Inspector or Toolcraft Exemplar or Inventor's Apprentice to add up to just a ton of damage out of nowhere.
Right, and there are just so many one-drops. This is what we sort of describe as redundant, the idea that it's not literally impossible, but it's very hard not to have a turn 1 play.
Yeah, 12 one-drops in the deck. The deck is looking to start on turn 1 and not looking to let up on pressure.
How well positioned is the deck within the field now that we know what we do know about the shape of new standard?
I like this deck against combo decks like Aetherworks Marvel because it's about a turn faster than the other red-white vehicles decks. It also does combine its haste cards to play very well against cards like Fumigate or Radiant Flames, which is actually what Makis is about to face in Carlos Romao's deck.
Okay, now any time that you do have that extra pace, there are obviously compromises. What does it lack, therefore? What won't we see this deck doing?
It's less equipped to play a long game. Its spells are cheaper and less impactful once the game goes past, their first 5 or 6 turns.
Okay, well, a phenomenal response from the Greek community when Makis Matsoukas made it into the top 8. There were another couple of Greek players here this weekend. One of them is across the studio to tell us a little more about your number 1 seed. So I'm going to hand you over to Brian David Marshall with Pavlos Kenelis.
Thanks, Rich. I'm here with Pavel, and we are talking about this incredible run that your friend Makis has been on. And what time is it right now in Greece?
It's like 3 in the morning.
And
it's like 13 hours difference.
Wow. And so and you said everybody's up, everybody's just waiting on pins and needles for this match.
I suppose, yes. Almost everyone is up and checking updates and tweets and all stuff. It's the whole weekend, it's the same. It's like everyone's awake, no one's asleep.
Yeah, I know when I talked to Makis, he said he had like 200, 250 messages this morning that he had to respond to.
Yeah, it's crazy, it's crazy. Everyone is awake, no one is asleep.
Now, I wanted to ask you about the deck that we're going to see Makis playing because it doesn't look like any of the other red-white decks we're seeing. And again, you guys play tested together for this tournament, but not even the deck that you're playing. This is very much his deck.
Yeah, it's his deck. He built it on his own from the very beginning, since the first spoilers from Kaladesh.
And tell me a little bit about what it would mean for the Greek Magic community to see Makis win these last 2 matches that remain in the tournament potentially for him.
Definitely, everyone would go nuts, and it would be a great opportunity for everyone to see that. One of our own, on our own level, not great pro players or stuff like that, can do it also like everyone else.
Now, I know you guys have traveled around to a lot of RPTQs and PPTQs to get here. Do you think this is going to, increase the number? Do you think we're going to see more Greek players trying to get here to the Pro Tour based on seeing Makis' success?
I definitely hope so. It should work that way. Because we are a small country, only few people are playing PPTQs. So with greater number, there are greater chances for more Greek players to come and play the Pro Tour. It would be great.
It would be great. We'd love to see you here. We have a seat waiting for you when you get here. Pavlos, I'm going to let you get back to rooting for your friend. Okay. And thanks for staying up with us, Greece.
Thank you.
We appreciate it.
We certainly do. So, Makis Matsoukas, that's your number 1 seed. He's facing someone we've seen twice already today. It's Carlos Romao of Brazil. Let's take a look at Carlos's profile for you. He is 34 years old. He's got 246 lifetime pro points. Yes, he's looking very happy. So would you if you'd won a team Grand Prix, an individual Grand Prix, and were in the semi-finals of a Pro Tour all in the last 6 weeks. 14 years ago, he was the world champion, 2002, playing a control deck then as well as he is now. Let's take a look at that deck for you. He is playing Jeskai control. Luis.
Torrential Gearhulk is kind of the standout card here. It's what's giving this deck the tools to win in the late game and present a pretty fast clock. It lets you recast your Glimmer of Genius or your removal spells like Harness Lightning. So Carlos is looking to control the game, stabilize the board, and then kill with Torrential Gearhulk.
All right, well, he's already won 2 rounds. Now he faces the number 1 seed. Give us a prediction. Will we see red-white tokens spew out and get the job done for Makis? Will Greece be triumphant, or will Carlos Romao keep on trucking with Jeskai control?
I'm going to go with Carlos here.
All right, well, let's see if he's right. It is time for the first semi-final here at Pro Tour Kaladesh.